Gibbs here. She's come to us from Notre Dame, the Department of Economics. She's going to be talking about some of her work on full-day kindergarten.
That's right. Thank you.
And you'll take questions as you go?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes. And I want to thank you all for being here because I always realize at this point in the term just how busy this point in the term always feels. So thanks for spending the time. And I also realized in coming here, of all places, sort of saying longer term might be a bit of a misnomer in the case of this paper, because I know Jason has work that's looking at like 2 generations out from an intervention. So this is longer term relative to what had been studied in the full day kindergarten literature before, but it's not quite that long term. So I am going to be talking about full day kindergarten expansions today, and I'm really excited to get your feedback and reactions to this paper because I think I hope I'm bringing sort of a different lens to the question than has been explored before, and I think it has particular implications for inequality. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of why the focus on early childhood investments, but as I know you've had other folks who study these topics, and I probably don't need to do much convincing on that front, but I'll give you a little background on that. And in particular, sort of why I think of full day kindergarten sitting in this space and actually being a particularly important policy intervention in this area, what we know to date, which is fairly limited about full day kindergarten effectiveness, and sort of how I see this particular paper sitting in that broader literature and the contribution of it. So we know that achievement gaps emerge early, both by race and ethnicity and by SES, and that they're persistent. So in particular, when we look at IQ measured up to age 8, and this is from a Council of Economic Advisors report, and then math scores in the dashed lines for kids from high-income families in the top panel and lower-income families in the bottom panel, the gap is just widening through those early childhood years and actually is sort of at its widest and then persistent at the time in which kids are entering formal schooling at about age 5. And so you see this sort of very stark income gradient, right, in both in literacy skills and mathematics skills. A little less of a gradient in sort of the behavioral problems areas, but still this relationship between family income or family SES and the skills or behaviors that kids are exhibiting when they arrive at school. So just to sort of demonstrate what the gaps look like by high SES and low SES, about a standard deviation in both math and reading language arts. When you compare kids from high SES families to medium SES families, or sort of middle income families, it's more like a half of a standard deviation. But really pronounced gaps that are present when kids enter school. So 2 key points I want to sort of make here, and then we'll move on. The first is that these gaps are present when kids arrive at school. That obviously points to the importance of everything that's happened before they get there, so the importance of early investments, home environments, parenting. The other point you see in that Council of Economic Advisors figure is that schooling is not closing these gaps, right? And this is not to indict what we're doing in K through 12 schooling, because we don't know what the gaps would look like sort of otherwise, absent the investments we're currently making. But we do know that the gaps are persistent throughout the schooling years. So this points really to early childhood as kind of a critical period for intervention. We also know sort of a broad theoretical or sort of conceptual argument about the importance of early skill development. Skills beget skills, this notion that what we do in the early childhood years sort of sets the stage or the foundation for skill development thereafter. We also have sort of this, I chose a couple papers, but a really burgeoning literature on the long-term effects of investments we make in the early childhood years. Here I sort of highlight Head Start, the federally funded preschool program for kids from disadvantaged families, the Abecedarian and Perry preschool programs, which were sort of model or comprehensive preschool programs. And then, from our developmental psychologist colleagues, this notion that children's brains are particularly malleable in these early childhood years and that plasticity is declining in age. So it is particularly impactful for us to intervene sort of as early as possible. So in particular, I'm going to point to what we've been doing around kindergarten enrollment in the US over the past couple decades. And what you see here is kindergarten enrollment in thousands. The solid line is total enrollment. The black dashed line that's increasing over this time frame is full day kindergarten enrollment, and then the declining line is half day kindergarten enrollment. So what you see here is that we've been sort of moving kids into full day environments in their kindergarten year, which is sort of seen as the entry into schooling or sort of the transition into formal schooling over the course of the past 2 decades. In 1995, full day enrollment eclipsed half day enrollment. And now you have about 75-80% of kids in kindergarten are in full day settings. So I'd argue, just as sort of to put a finer point on this, that this is actually probably the most intensely we've been investing in the early childhood years in a concerted way, though it's been happening relatively quietly. So if you think about the sort of broader conversations about childcare quality or universal pre-K, we sort of think of those as the hot policy topics. And I think full day kindergarten has been kind of sitting in the background, but actually one of the ways in which states and localities have been investing pretty heavily in the early childhood years.
That's a one-shot deal, right? It says nothing about 2, 3, 4, about preschool.
That's right.
Organized childcare or preschool.
Right. Yes. So this is sort of absent those other or sort of aside from those other investments. Yeah, what's been happening. And so actually to sort of talk about this a little more, when we look at the early childhood longitudinal surveys, the kindergarten cohorts of 1998, which are in the left-hand bars, and of 2010, which are in the gray slanted bars, diagonal lines bars, here's what preschool program participation looks like for those 2 kindergarten cohorts. Preschool sort of broadly defined, Head Start, having been in no formal care prior to kindergarten entry. What we call in this paper I have with Daphne Basak and Scott Latham, public preschool and full-time preschool over that time frame. So this is like a period where we've been very focused on early childhood as an important sort of policy area. We've been making a lot of investments, or at least sort of talking about investments in this space. And you see that actually on these dimensions, there hasn't been a lot of movement. There has been a shift towards preschool being more publicly provided, and a little bit of a shift into it being more full-time, but generally not a lot of movement on sort of what participation looks like in the year before kindergarten. Whereas full-day kindergarten is growing pretty dramatically over that time frame. Having a pre-K classroom in your school has also increased. I sort of was surprised that small class size in kindergarten has not really moved much, given that that was an area of a lot of policy focus. And sort of having a majority of your peers having experienced preschool also hasn't moved over this time frame. So again, I think one of the major ways we've actually sort of moved kids' early childhood experiences is via the expansion of the kindergarten day. Also want to just kind of point out that the nature of full-day kindergarten has changed over time. So when you look at the 1998 ECLS kindergarten cohort, what you see is that if you're a Black child or a child from a low-income family, you're much more likely to have participated in full day, and that there have been shifts over this time frame. And so you have now many more white children and Hispanic children participating in full-day settings. The increases are actually pretty broadly distributed by SES. These are fairly similar gains across the SES distribution. But generally what's happening here is full-day kindergarten was provided by schools and districts that were largely serving disadvantaged populations and is now sort of more universally provided over time. So what do we know about the impact of full-day kindergarten? Sorry.
Is that another way of seeing that that's an urban-rural? Like, has growth mostly been in rural?
Not entirely. There were, that varies a bit by state, but there were rural districts that were providing all full day. It was largely viewed, I think, by school districts as sort of a way to kind of remediate kids early and catch them up, in particular for standardized testing that was coming down the pike. And so it was often used as a lever in districts that were sort of struggling on that dimension. And so I think that another point that I'll just sort of highlight here right before we turn to what the evidence looks like is that the nature of selection for the most part is whole schools or whole districts, and then increasingly over this time frame, whole states opting into providing full-day kindergarten. Not really the dimension on which we might first sort of think of parents deciding whether or not to send to half or full day. Generally, given the options available to you, that decision has kind of been made for you by in the policy environment in which your kids are going to school. So the studies that have looked at the impact of full-day kindergarten are sort of two broad kinds. There are several observational studies that use the 1998 cohort of the ECLS-K. And so this is comparing participants to non-participants with some ways of trying to address the selection issues. But of course, you might be concerned that kids who are in full-day settings are different than those in half-day settings on a number of dimensions that we can't quite capture. But there are positive effects of full-day K in this literature that generally fade out pretty rapidly. So when we check back in on kids who had full-day kindergarten at first grade, and by the ends of third and fifth grade, we don't see any differences. There's also sort of a smaller literature and somewhat inconsistent literature that uses, there are sort of small program evaluation studies within districts. There is one, this Holmes and McConnell site in 1990, that was a district in which schools were randomly assigned to providing full or half day, but it was a very small sample and generally underpowered to detect any differences. Again, what you see here is kind of a pattern of some early advantages for full-day kindergarten participants. And then I have some prior work that leverages lotteries that is basically assigned oversubscribed full-day kindergarten slots via these lotteries in several districts in Indiana. And I'll just highlight that what this entire literature does, including my own paper, is really look at the participant level effects, right? Compare kids who differ in their participation in full-day kindergarten or their offer of participation in full-day kindergarten, which, as I said, is somewhat inconsistent with what the policy landscape looks like, right? Which is whole schools or whole districts providing full-day kindergarten. So and for example, in my lottery study, this is sort of an anomalous setting in which you have variation within schools in what kids are getting. But generally the thrust here, I'll show you sort of the results from my experimental paper. These are in effect sizes or standard deviation units on end of kindergarten literacy skills. So you see about nearly a third of a standard deviation improvement for kids offered full-day kindergarten. These effects are particularly concentrated among Hispanic children. I don't actually see English language use or English language learning in this data, but we could assume that that might be a proxy for being from a non-English speaking home potentially.
78% of immigrant kids are born in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Immigrant kids are born in the United States. So a lot of these kids, have been exposed early on to English and ESL. It's not as big a problem.
Right.
As compared, but there are other households where Hispanic is the main language spoken at home, and there may be. So I've always wondered about somebody pulling that apart and trying to make it in.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much I can do in this data. One thing I'm trying to get the longer term data for these kids, so to be able to follow up on the kids that were experimentally assigned to full or half day, and there I'd like to actually look at identification for special services like English language learning services. But in that case, it would be sort of an outcome of the intervention, right? Because that identification is happening after they've been assigned to full or half day. But what I do know just sort of anecdotally from these districts, so the particular districts in Indiana that engaged in these lotteries were much more heavily Hispanic than sort of your average district in Indiana, perhaps not surprisingly. And that is because there's sort of, they included some communities with a migrant farming population. But I think, sort of the important upshot here is that is what this could potentially do to gaps. And so here's the sizes of gaps at the end of the kindergarten year for, in the gray bars, the full day kids, and in the white bars, the half day kids. And in particular, what you see is this big reduction in the gap between kids who identify as Hispanic and those who are not Hispanic, which, we could imagine might have important implications for sort of inequality throughout their educational trajectories, and is likely a result of sort of a shift in the language environment that they're exposed to, right? Or potentially that might be the mechanism. And this is, I think, probably fair for me to say, not inconsistent with the other literature on early childhood investments being more impactful in some cases for English language learning populations. So this is to set the stage then for what I think of as sort of a different question that I hope kind of complements what we've done before, but tackles it from a different angle, which is to leverage the expansions in full-day kindergarten provision across the United States over the past 2 decades and look at the effect on subsequent academic achievement in these places that have expanded. And so this is a different question in a couple different ways. I mean, I think obviously the participant level question was important to think about kind of the existence proof of whether or not full-day kindergarten can move the needle on early skill development. I think there was some question about whether, especially sort of young kids, being in these what we know to be more intensely academic environments over longer periods of time would really be beneficial for their learning. You could imagine that might not be the case. And so I think sort of just demonstrating that this could improve their early skills was important. But that also fails to capture some of the sort of systemic response that you might imagine from expanding full-day kindergarten. And so I'll talk a little bit more about what I think some of the mechanisms that might be at play here that we should be thinking about. The first several are obviously, they're sort of mechanisms even when you're thinking about the participant level effects, right? The first obviously being that we think more instructional time might enter into the production of educational outcomes. You're also crowding out whatever the sort of other care would be or the other use of time in those hours in which kids are now in their kindergarten classroom longer. So you can imagine that would lead to some heterogeneity in the impacts of being in these settings, right? If the other use of time would be sort of better or worse for your skill development. So, you know, there's being in front of a TV, and then there's also being home with a high human capital mom who's taking you to music lessons and that kind of thing. It's also a subsidy to families, right? And so it makes more resources available for them. It could potentially free up parents for employment. Also importantly, you know, there's other things that happen in the school day when kids are there longer. So they might be getting more meals while they're there. They might be taking a nap or getting additional recess time. In most of the cases where these policies have been rolled out, they do specify sort of the added instructional time that has to happen in the day. But because kids are there longer, they're often getting some of these other things, which we might believe also are important for their outcomes and their skill development. And then I think a piece that this paper is able to explore that is not present in the participant level effects literature is thinking about sort of how systems then respond to having whole cohorts who are more exposed to full-day kindergarten, right? So you get sort of invest more in a cohort, and then what does that mean then for what first grade teachers can do and beyond, right? Sort of there might be spillovers to non-participating peers, and there might be some systemic response and sort of improvements in the subsequent inputs in response to the fact that these cohorts are more prepared and demonstrating more skills early. So a little bit about the policy landscape around kindergarten and full-day kindergarten specifically. 10 states in DC actually provide full-day kindergarten at no charge to families. You see those states there. In 16 states, this might be somewhat surprising to people, kindergarten attendance is mandatory. So in lots of states, it is not. In fact, in Indiana, I was somewhat shocked that the mandatory school starting age is 8. So you don't actually have to be in school until you're 8. I don't know many parents who invoke that flexibility, but 7 of the 10 states that require full-day provision also mandate kindergarten attendance, so all kids are going to kindergarten in a full-day setting. And there are 24 states that specify a funding formula that funds full-day like it does first grade and beyond. So the sort of flip side of that, or the implication of that, is that there are 26 states in which there's actually sort of a funding penalty to providing full-day kindergarten. Just to give you some examples of some of the legislation that's happening over this time frame. So you have a bill in New Mexico in 2001, full-day kindergarten programs shall be phased in over a 5-year period. Some priority to school districts that serve children in schools with the highest proportion of students most in need. There's a bill in Oregon in 2009 establishes this full-day kindergarten implementation committee to aid and advise the assembly around providing full-day kindergarten programs. So these are some of the bills that are passing over this time frame that are driving some of the expansions that you saw. And here's what the state level change in full-day kindergarten participation looks like in the 50 states represented by the bars between the 2001 school year and the 09-10 school year, which is going to be my time frame of interest that I'll talk a bit more about. So you see some states are increasing, this is percentage point change, so some states have massive increases in the participation in full day. Some states are actually scaling back or have very little change, but this is essentially the variation that I'm interested in over this time frame.
Why the scale back? What explains that left-hand side?
So there is some budget crises happening in this time frame. So you have, like, for example, just a famous one I know about is the Chicago Public Schools had been providing all full day for many, many years and went to half day because of budget shortfalls. They did this sort of sneaky thing where they actually kept kids at school for the full day, but they didn't have certified teachers in the extra hours. So it was sort of a way of cutting costs by shifting it to kind of just daycare, essentially. And so you do have some of that happening in this time frame too.
Does that suggest that this is the marginal program in school budgets, it's the margin at which you adjust daytime, it's the margin you couldn't adjust teacher quality, you could adjust resources.
Yes.
Adjust lots of things.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And I think, so, you know, when I talk about sort of what the bundle is, you know, I think being able to tease apart what the piece is that's actually sort of affecting kids' skill development would be important if you know, is important when you want to think about how to do this most cost effectively, right? Because if it really is just something about supervised time that is not in front of a TV, right? Or, you know, if it's even just about sort of having a healthy meal and a nap, or, you know, whatever those, some of those things might matter, you could imagine there are more cost-effective ways for us to deploy that than having a certified teacher in the room for the full day, for sure. So here's what the state level changes look like, broken out by quartiles, with the darkest quartiles being the places with the most change over this time frame, the largest increases in full-day kindergarten provision. And much of that is via these legislative changes that I mentioned, and we've done some work with an RA to try to code up all of the legislative changes over this time frame. It's a little tricky because, as you saw in sort of the text of some of these bills, some of them are just sort of like encouraging more provision. Some actually have some financial implications, and so that landscape is pretty varied. So what you have essentially happening over this time frame is what I'll characterize broadly. It's sort of two groups of states. You have these high change states and these low change states. Low change states, represented by the dashed line, were sort of always providing a fair amount of full day kindergarten. They increase a little over this time frame. But what's really sort of where the movement is these states that were lagging behind the national average at sort of like 40% of kids in full day that are catching up over this time frame. So the sort of mean change in states over the time frame of interest is 17 percentage points. Yes?
But just to be clear, most of the policy has been, there are these broad state laws about this and in some of the states, but most of the policy about whether to implement full day kindergarten is happening in the school district as a whole. Is that right?
I think that's probably fair. I don't know that I would come down definitely as, like sort of how much of the change is driven by one or the other. I mean, there is a fair amount of legislative movement, but yeah, I mean, I guess over the time frame, I would say it's probably more driven by district movement. I think that's probably fair. Yeah.
I was wondering if there's like private kindergarten options during times that like are a lot of people that are moving into the full day options provided by the public schools, like are they substituting away from just like paying for, you know, kindergarten at a private school or at tuition at a nearby public school that has full day?
So I think this is a good question, and it's some combination of kind of all the things you mentioned. So there are places that were, including some places in Indiana that I know about anecdotally, that were providing full day for a fee. So they were, half day was sort of fully subsidized, and then you could pay for the afternoon. It is certainly the case that private schools over this time frame were more likely to provide full day, and so what you could have is some shifting from private schools back into the public schools. That's actually something you'll see it sort of at the end of the talk is something I want to check next. Is sort of what has been the effect of these public school changes on private school enrollment. And then the other possibility is sort of supplementing with either childcare subsidies, so using a childcare subsidy at a private provider in the afternoon hours, or some other form of childcare, right? Informal or formal in those hours. Okay, so what I'm going to use here are sort of two main data sources. The first is going to be to construct my full day kindergarten participation rates across the states, which you've already seen. I'm using the October school enrollment supplement of the CPS. The relevant years here, as I've said, are going to be 2000, 2001 through 09-10. I'm going to use weighted 3-year moving averages because of, you know, noise induced by the survey sampling. And then I'm going to match this up with the Stanford Education Data Archive, which was developed by Sean Reardon and some colleagues to basically generate NAEP-equated test scores in all school districts in the United States. And so the NAEP is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's given to 4th and 8th graders, math and reading. There's other tests as well, but that's sort of the main focus. It's known as the nation's report card. And so what they're able to do, because as you know, states implement different tests, different standardized tests, but they basically use the NAEP sample and the state test and sort of align them so that they can then put the state tests all on essentially the same scale. So this is nice for me because it provides both mean achievement in reading and math measured in standard deviation units, but also Hispanic white and Black white achievement gaps. Again, also in reading and math. And the data set covers 08-09 through 2012-13 school years, which is what's sort of defining my full day kindergarten participation data time frame of interest. So just to kind of walk you through what this looks like. I have school years 2001 through 2012-13, and you can think about cohorts moving through the kindergarten regime in their states, right? And they'll be more or less exposed to full day kindergarten based on what's going on in the state. And so this first cohort is in kindergarten in 0001, and then you see them through their entire K through 12 trajectory. And then where I see them in the CETA data is their 8th grade test score in 08-09. The second cohort is going to enter kindergarten the next year, see them through 11th grade. Where I see them in the CETA data is in 7th and 8th. And did you have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
No.
So do you know anything at the district level about participation in full or half day when the Common Core data? Nothing?
No. So you see kindergarten teachers and you see students. I've tried to do some things where I can sort of construct ratios and see, but it's really messy. And because you also have states implementing some rules around class size in this time frame, I'm a little worried about how to use ratios to interpret what's happening, because in half-day kindergarten settings, you have sort of two, at least my understanding is you have kind of two main ways in which this plays out. One is the sort of at least what my prior vision was of it is like the half-day kindergarten teacher who has a classroom in the morning and then those kids go home. But there are also places that will have that teacher for the full day, and she teaches a morning group and an afternoon group. And so sort of disentangling these two things in that data is tricky. So I have tried that, but I can't do really anything at the district level.
You couldn't use any other kind of survey data to sort of give you, I'm just sort of worried that within a state, there's a lot going on at the district level that could be very different.
So I'll show you one state. So in Indiana, I do have district level full day kindergarten provision. And so there I'll be able to drill down to the district level. And I'd love to be able to do it in more states, particularly some of these states where there's been a lot of movement over this time frame where you could actually use the sort of district level variation.
Anything to get a sense of, is it poor districts, not so poor districts? The ones that are being affected on the margin.
Yep.
So going back to this point before,
Mm-hmm.
you get some, you don't necessarily have to know for every single district, but if you knew some characteristics of, Tennessee, the marginal ones are kind of rural districts, and then Illinois, it's Chicago, something like that.
Right.
That might help a lot.
Yeah, at a sort of more blunt level, I can tell you some about the states that will actually sort of map onto what we think is probably happening, which is the sort of more affluent states are the later adopters here. But I would expect that that's what it would look like when you drill down to the district. But I could do some more around that in Indiana specifically too, like sort of characterizing what the districts look like. And so then this just continues, right? So with each cohort, I see a sort of an additional year of data. So this fifth cohort is the fifth and sixth cohorts are where I see the most years of student achievement data. And so these sort of years in the red boxes are what I'm going to look at for thinking about the sort of downstream effects of more full day kindergarten provision in these school systems. So to tell you a little bit about sort of what states look like for all states in DC, and then for what I called those high change states and the low change states. So these are sort of above the mean and below the mean in terms of the change over this time frame. And so, sort of not surprisingly, what you see is the high change states start very sort of low provision, they catch up. So these look very different sort of in the baseline year, and then pretty similar at the end of this growth. And so in terms of population and gross state product and things like this, I think what is somewhat not surprising is that the high change states, or those that were low providers of full day kindergarten at the beginning of this time frame, tend to look a little better off, which is consistent with what my prior would have been. Okay, and so then also looking at sort of what the state early childhood landscape looks like. So here I'm borrowing from a number of different data sources, because I think one of the things we would be concerned about is that as these full day kindergarten changes are happening, that these are sort of states that are doing other things on early childhood dimensions. So looking at the proportion of 4-year-olds in state pre-K, state pre-K spending per child, and the state pre-K quality index are all from the National Institute of Early Education Research annual yearbooks about pre-K in the states. I have pre-K teachers and pre-K students per capita. That is from the Common Core data. And then I have Head Start enrollment and Head Start funding from the program information reports out of HHS. And so just to kind of give you a sense, there aren't any sort of major differences on this front, although you do see that maybe sort of fewer pre-K students, or sort of like smaller pre-K programs in the states that are also what I think of as kind of the late adopters of full day kindergarten. Also maybe some lower Head Start enrollment, which is also consistent with them being sort of the more advantaged places as a general rule too. So something to sort of keep in mind too when we're thinking about these changes. So what I'm going to do here, is I'm sure you all are already aware, is I'm going to leverage this variation across states. Then I'm going to drill down in Indiana and leverage variation across school districts. And over time, as we've seen in sort of the Head Start context with state pre-K programs and with the introduction of kindergarten. And so here I'm going to use a grade level specific academic achievement outcome, so mapping those cohorts back again to what they experienced in kindergarten. I'll also look at gaps in a particular school district in a state where the variation is happening at the state level in a particular year. So full day kindergarten is going to be a continuous measure of the percentage of kindergarten students in full day settings in a particular state or school district in year. I'd be open to hearing your thoughts about this. I've thought about sort of whether or not it's worth trying to kind of dichotomize this. You've seen sort of my blunt take at the low change, high change states. But there's a lot of sort of year-to-year growth happening. So you saw that one particular policy out of New Mexico that said, sort of scaling up over 5 years. And that kind of is what you see in the state level data. There aren't sort of these particularly large shocks in a particular year where you have, sort of all of the growth concentrated from a year-to-year change. Although in Indiana, that was sort of more the way, but that's not the norm. So I'm going to use state and year fixed effects, and I'm going to cluster on school district here. So, yeah.
Why school district rather than state?
For clustering? My concern sort of was that, I'm thinking, I can cluster at the sort of lower level, and since we think there might be things about the school district that, are affecting, test scores in that particular district, I do that, but I could cluster at a higher level too.
I mean, the mean variation is at the state level.
Right.
So that's usually what is on.
Yeah, so I've done it both ways, and I feel like when I showed this to Sean at a conference, he was asking for sort of the lower level of clustering, but I could do that.
Does it matter?
It doesn't. It doesn't make a big difference, yeah.
Sorry, I'm just a little bit confused about the data. Do you have shared tests for every year, or it's just the 3rd and 8th?
No, so it's just district level. No, I'm sorry, I have 3rd through 8th grade, but it's district level, right? So it's I see a whole cohort, like a 3rd grade cohort and beyond. Yeah.
And it's
Jason?
percent of enrolled students who are in full day, not percent of children.
That's right. It's think of the denominator as kids in kindergarten.
So, Matt, I wonder, for one, is there no change in mandatory kindergarten over this time is one thing?
So I've done some looking at this, and essentially the changes to like mandatory and the changes to mandatory enrollment age seem to be largely non-binding, right? So parents are sending their kids to kindergarten, even if the state doesn't necessarily require it.
That's, 'cause you're maxing out on like 75%.
Yeah.
But that's not the right, yeah, so what's the actual, number of people who aren't in kindergarten, percentage?
Oh, so like percentage of age eligible kids who are not in kindergarten. So it's like very tiny. I have checked this. It is something like 3% of age eligible kids are not in, and they are largely kids who then go on to be homeschooled. So I mean, it seems.
Do you have public and private or just public?
So this is just public, but I can see in the CPS private school enrollment, which to Elise's earlier question is something I'm interested in, sort of looking at whether that has been where shifts have occurred.
Because of the public schools and because
Yeah, and I mean, just descriptively, when you look at the data, there was much more, like there was much high, at sort of the beginning of this time frame, there was much higher participation in private kindergarten enrollment, and then that, drops off in the higher grades, right? And which is sort of shifting, I think, when full day was not available in public systems, you would use that for just that first year and then shift into the public system. So, okay, so just to sort of be forthright about what I think the advantages are of this relative to sort of like my prior paper and some other work is that obviously we can look at cross cohort, cross-state comparisons to look at the impact of these expansions, which I think has this nice feature of being able to capture kind of the GE effects or kind of the net effects of a policy change if we think there are important spillovers that may be affecting sort of non-participating kids. Obviously, we might be worried about sort of the non-random adoption of these policies, and so I think that's sort of the major limitation of this design or any kind of design like this. In thinking about those trade-offs, I think it's worth adding to what we know about participant level effects to think about some of these broader systemic effects. So when I look at each sort of these characteristics of states and regress it on my treatment variable just to see what relationships are, I don't see any statistically significant variation by the sort of state level characteristics, including K through 12 per pupil expenditures, or in those various pre-K measures and Head Start measures. I'll also then use these as controls. Yes, question?
Population, are you looking at the full population or a population of school-aged kids or families?
I'm just using the state population, but I have tried it a couple different ways, and it all sort of looks essentially the same. Yep. Yeah, and I sort of have limited this to like a slightly more parsimonious set of these characteristics and pre-K controls. I also have lots of things from the UK Poverty Center that I've also thrown in that don't really make a difference around sort of other program participation like TANF and WIC and things like that. Okay, so then turning to some results. So when we look at mean achievement, in the top panel we're looking at reading achievement, in the bottom panel math. Here, and remember these are the outcomes are in standard deviation units. The increment of change here is a percentage point increase in full day kindergarten participation. Obviously, that makes these coefficients look quite tiny, but the alternative way to scale them, moving from all half day to all full day, makes them look quite large. So you can think about over this time frame, the average annual change is about a 2 percentage point increase, but the average change over the full time frame is about 17 percentage points. So what you see are these increases in both reading achievement and math achievement associated with having greater full day kindergarten provision for those cohorts. This is all grades pooled together, it's essentially consistent when I include those state demographic controls and pre-K controls for the pre-K environment lagged by 1 year, right? So the pre-K environment preceding the kindergarten year.
So the effect size here, the state went from nobody in full day to 100%, that's a 0.4.
No, so here it's just a 1 percentage point increase, right? So it's moving from, so this is, as opposed to doing the full shift, right, from 0, 1.
Is that not what I should do to go?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Okay, but that seems big.
Yes.
A 0.4 standard deviation for
0.04, right?
a half a day shift to
Or
school.
0.4, yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
I just wanna
But that would
think
be
about-
from moving all half day to all full day, right? Which is, would be which is not sort of the realistic
But
policy
I thought
context.
about that at an individual kid level.
Yep.
That's me going from half day
Yep.
to full day. That's the effect size, right?
Yeah.
So that seems big. I'm just trying to relate that now to kind of other studies
Yep.
of this amount of extra time. And
So
whatever
in my
it is.
experimental study, moving kids from half day to full day was about a third of a standard deviation increase in their literacy skills.
That's pretty close to this.
Right, and so if you imagine that there's any spillovers too, then you know that this is capturing over and above sort of the direct effects.
Okay.
You know, that I think they're plausible given that, you know, you're sort of doubling instructional time in what we think is a pretty critical year.
Plus the Latinos were probably more disadvantaged, plus the states that were more disadvantaged had the biggest changes.
Well, it's actually sort of the least, it's the more advantaged states that had the biggest changes, right? Yeah, so let's, I mean, I think in turning to thinking about inequality, let's, here are the results by grade level. So just quickly, these are reading in the dark bars and math in the lighter bars for 3rd through 8th grade. These are all statistically significant unless otherwise noted. And so, you know, perhaps notable that sort of in the years most proximal to the intervention, you see sort of the biggest effects, particularly in math. Math has been largely absent from the prior conversation about full day kindergarten effects. So I think that's also sort of a contribution here, is that we're able to look at both reading and math over, again, what is the somewhat longer term, right? Not super long term, but longer term than we've looked at in prior studies. And then let's think about gaps. Here are the black-white gaps where we don't see much happening in terms of what gaps look like. But then when we look at specifically broken out by grade level, like in 3rd grade math, we actually see this sort of enlarging of the black-white gap. Also statistically significant in 5th grade math, but you know, the pattern is a little messy here, so I won't. So
the black-white gap at each district level, that's the outcome now.
yeah, the black-white gap, but remember aggregate, so the variations happening here at the state level.
So you have scope within a state to sort of say, are districts converging, which I thought was sort of part of the story here,
Yep.
right? So you could create other statistics about the dispersion.
So you're thinking think about second moments
Yeah.
and yeah.
And characterize the, you know the fraction, black or whatever, those districts as well. I mean, it's a different way to look at this.
Mm-hmm.
You also have Head Start variable in there.
Yeah.
This is where Head Start fades out, right? Where it goes to 0 in 3rd grade. And you're showing
Head Start, full day kindergarten in the prior literature, pre-K, lots of things fade out by by these grade levels, right?
I saw the last 2 pictures from Big Kick said.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it is. I think that's something important here too. Is like seeing anything sort of in these grade because we're already a few years removed from your exposure to kindergarten when we pick you up in your 3rd grade test scores. So seeing sort of anything persistent, I think, is important. This is where I think thinking about the nature of the policy shift is important, right? Because if what you have is whole schools or whole districts moving to full provision, and that is not that is like by construction not the context in studies that are looking at participant level effects, right? Because researchers, including myself in those contexts, need to have variation within these settings, right? Which sets up a different sort of downstream response by teachers, right? Because if I'm teaching in a district where I am a 1st grade teacher and half of the kids are coming in having had full day kindergarten, so half of the kids are coming in having had twice as much instructional time in the year before, and half had just half day kindergarten. That's a very different sort of landscape for me to navigate than these settings where the shifts are sort of much more whole school and whole district level, right? So I think that's important because the contexts where we have documented fade out are always these contexts where now I go into this setting where I'm going to have peers who didn't have the intervention, right? And teachers are going to respond to that. What we think might be fairly rational response might be to catch up the kids who did not have the early intervention, like Head Start or pre-K or full day K, in which case we would see a closing of the gap between participants and non-participants that is actually sort of a function of the intervention, right? It's a spillover of the intervention. And so that's why I think this kind of a policy context that is sort of the more real world way these programs roll out is important to explore, because I think in all of those settings we've sort of forced variation within setting, which is not kind of which is abnormal in how these programs are provided. Yep.
Can you say anything about the types of skills that maybe are being developed by these programs based on what subsequent grades have bigger and smaller effects? I'm thinking especially about like math.
Yeah, so just sort of a general, I mean, those of you who study education know this, that we see lots of sort of school-based interventions tend to move math more than reading skills. And in part, at least I think one of the main arguments I hear from people who study learning and instruction is that because a lot of what's important for reading development happens in the home, and so schools are sort of able to move the needle on math more. But, you know, I think sort of drawing on the larger literature around early childhood, one of the things that people have speculated, Heckman and others, is that actually what early childhood programs sort of move the most is non-cognitive skill, or what we call non-cognitive skills, which you could also think of sort of like naming the error term in some ways. And so, you know, I think we haven't gotten to a point where we sort of teased apart exactly what all of those are. I mean, I think we think that things like conscientiousness and attentiveness and paying attention and listening and sorts of those sorts of things, which, you know, I think makes a lot of sense that being in a full day setting would help develop some of those skills too, relative to a half day setting, sort of learning about being in this environment, which could be very important for your subsequent trajectory. And also, you know, could be important for your test taking skills, right? And so I've often sort of wondered about how much, particularly early childhood tests, so this is going to sort of be less relevant as we move from left to right, how much they capture your ability to sort of follow through on a task and sit still and, you know, sort of be persistent on a test, rather than sort of just also just your sort of academic skills, right? And I speculate that the sort of importance of those skills might be declining in age, right? That, you know, by 8th grade, everybody is somewhat, you know, able to sit still and take the test, but that those skills were probably more important closer to the intervention. The existing work has primarily looked at literacy skills, mostly just because of that's what's measured, and particularly in early grades. And so what you see sort of very early is that being in these settings improves kids' ability to recognize letters and make letter sounds, and kind of the early sorts of literacy pre-reading skills. So, you know, I think, you know, you can think about sort of how that manifests in downstream academic skills after that. Okay, so then when we turn to looking at Hispanic white gaps, what we do see is actually both in reading and math, slightly larger gaps as a result of these full day kindergarten expansions, or as associated with these full day kindergarten expansions. And so what that looks like, sort of interestingly, in 3rd grade here, for reading, the Hispanic white gap actually shrinks, right, in the 3rd grade, and then sort of basically goes away. So we don't see any sort of effects on that gap thereafter, but we see this widening math gap down the road. So, you know, I think the sort of grade level patterns are a little harder to interpret, but this would be consistent with the participant level effects that show sort of biggest gains concentrated among this population. And so, and that it's then, you know, sort of seems to persist into 3rd grade is I think somewhat interesting. But again, I think the patterns when you break out by grade level are a little bit messier. So, yeah.
I'm confused why you're showing us these, because I mean, there's differences within school districts, and the different school districts are serving different populations. So it's not clear whether this effect is because there's difference, the school districts that moved from half day to full day had different populations of students in terms of whites and blacks and Hispanics, or it's because the effect sizes on particular students are different.
Right, because both of those are going to be embedded when you're thinking about these sort of broader effects.
I'm not sure what I learned from it.
Well, so, I mean, I would argue that as the policymaker, right, I'm sort of interested in both of those things because they're both, you know, I'm interested in as, say, a state level policymaker who's saying, districts we're going to move to being, providing full day for all, essentially, is going to be the goal, then,
I mean, if my states look, that's gonna be different in different states.
right. But so you don't think the sort of net policy effect is an interesting question? So
I think the overall policy effect on test scores, but within group, I'm not sure exactly how to interpret it.
within grade level?
Comparing two groups to each other.
Right. Oh, so you mean the gaps?
I mean the gaps,
Yeah.
yeah.
The gaps.
Yeah, you're just saying there's a bigger effect, in some cases, a bigger effect on blacks and whites.
Well, so because I think what the existing participant level work has shown us is sort of which groups we think are more affected, and then what this adds is the fact that we're also shifting who is participating, right? So we're simultaneously we have the effects that might be more concentrated among certain groups, and we are shifting more white and higher income kids into this what was once targeted intervention.
Right, that's what makes it confusing, because it's combining two very different kinds of
Right,
things.
but I think in the field of education, there is, for better or maybe worse, a lot of focus on gaps, not levels, right? And so to the extent that you, as a state, think you're moving to full, like districts have done it on their
Yeah.
own, and as a state, you say, okay, we're gonna go to full-time, and this is gonna reduce gaps.
Which would-
Chances are it won't, because the districts, right? So I take your point that it's maybe not the most interesting question, but I think it's actually very policy relevant.
Well, because I think the
They
way
actually care about the gap, not just the level.
But you could create the state level gaps. I mean, part of the confusion here is these are district level gaps. You
Right.
could actually aggregate out to the state level.
right,
Because you know the populations of these districts.
right.
Yeah, and I think you could get something closer to what maybe policymakers want, which is the state level black-white gap or whatever. But I don't think that's exactly it, and I think that would help a little bit with this compositional issue, although it's sort of unclear to me still.
Well, so I guess what the point I would make is that I think we already knew something about effects on levels, right? And the policy implication you would draw from that is what might be, well, when provided universally, this is going to lift the sort of achievement of certain kids more, and could have, good implications for gap sizes, right? I think that would be that was how I interpreted my own work and the more concentrated effects among Hispanic students. But then when you also sort of have this shift of sort of moving kids who are also going to realize benefits, though not as large, then you actually could have this effect of exacerbating inequalities. I think the sort of why I think, though it is embedding both of those things, it adds something over and above what the participant level effects literature had said and what the policy implication of that work had been.
So the other thing I don't understand is you only have one treatment variable here, which is the percentage of everybody that's enrolled in pre-K,
In full day, yep.
Full K, at the state level. But you can do that by race, too. I mean, noisier.
Yeah, the samples in the CPS are so small that it's really noisy. Like, these are already fairly noisy, and so I'm a little nervous about doing that. I think it's
Part of the issue here is just so as these things are moving out, are you picking up like more Hispanic students are being treated?
right.
Or is the effect size larger? I think it's just sort of a different way to restate what Chris is saying. And I think you have some data to get at that.
Yeah, so I think I could do some. Yeah, I could probably.
When you mentioned earlier migrant populations too, you'd be looking at really different kids by the time
Right.
you get to the end.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think that's in some ways that's kind of the that was the intention of moving from a targeted to a universal intervention, right? Was sort of thinking about shifting the composition of kids in the classroom, and so I think in some ways that's sort of embedded in the broader policy effect. So let me just show you a little bit about Indiana, which is going to be sort of a little more limited in scope, just given the data I have from the state. But in Indiana, you have this big sort of policy shift induced by the Assembly passing legislation in 2007 that would basically provide a full-day kindergarten grant. You can sort of think of topping off the per pupil expenditure for kids in kindergarten settings to compensate for the extra time. And Indiana had been sort of lagging behind the national average in kids in full day. So beginning in the subsequent school year, school districts, charter schools could receive this sort of top-off grant. It was basically express your interest in receiving it, and it was allocated on a per-pupil basis to schools and districts. And so in the prior year, 41% of Indiana kindergarten students were in full day, and that grows by 20 percentage points just in this single year. So as I mentioned, this is sort of one of the contexts in which there was a very large shift induced by the state legislation. And so here's what it looks like in districts across the state. And so the dark, again, are the highest quartile in terms of how much movement, including some districts that move from all half day to all full day in this time frame. Indianapolis, the capital of the state and obviously the most populous city, was providing full day prior to this change. Full day for all prior to this change. So what I have from the State Department of Education is the universe of kindergarten students and then their half or full day status in those 2 school years surrounding the policy change. So I have more limited years, but I have this finer grain data at the district level that I'm going to, again, match up to the CETA achievement data. Here, the relevant grades then are going to be 3rd through 6th grade because the school year is covered by the CETA data. And so just to sort of show you how that maps on, you've got the 06-07 kindergarten cohort, or sort of the prior to the big change cohort, and you see them in their 3rd through 6th grade test scores, and then you have the post cohort. And so what we see here is, again, some improvements in mean achievement, both in reading and math associated with these increases across districts. You see perhaps some widening of the black-white gap here, but not a lot to say on the gaps in the context of these particular districts. I should mention that obviously you see more districts with test score means because obviously you have to have some kids that are contributing to the construction of the Hispanic white and black white test scores, and you have some districts that are fairly homogeneous and do not have gap data. Okay, so thinking about sort of how to interpret this, and I'll be interested in sort of carrying the discussion on further. I think what we see is sort of consistent with higher mean achievement in reading and math, and I think potentially some interesting persistence that we hadn't documented prior to that because of limitations with the prior literature and data in being able to follow kids. And I think potentially that's important because I think it's also maybe capturing, as I said, what is like an instructional response to the fact that kids are better prepared or have more exposure to this investment, which is both the direct effects on participants and spillovers. In particular, I'm able to look at math achievement, which where there are some particularly pronounced effects and has been largely absent from the prior literature, again, because of data limitations. And I think what I'm interested in about this pursuit in general is that what has been this broad sort of shift from being a targeted intervention to being what is sort of a near or quasi-universal intervention, which could have these negative consequences for achievement gaps as you sort of move kids who were not served by the intervention before into these settings, and they also benefit, maybe not to the same degree as the prior targets of this kind of intervention. You could potentially sort of exacerbate inequality or widen these gaps. And I think this conversation about whether early childhood investments in particular should be targeted or universal has been kind of a sort of raging area for policy discussion, because you can imagine, I sort of don't have to walk you through why we might think a targeted intervention could be more effective in these settings, why we might want to capitalize on the peer effects that would be induced from a universal intervention, and so sort of why this has been an active area for policy conversation. So there's a couple extensions here. Again, happy to discuss this more, but so as I mentioned, we've gathered all of the sort of state level policy changes. You could think about sort of using that, using those policy shifts, so there's sort of broadly whether or not the state has a policy, or I think sort of more precisely a policy with some teeth around expanding full day kindergarten could be used to sort of instrument for these expansions, or to construct event studies of sort of policy adopters versus non-adopters. over this time frame. And then in terms of measuring outcomes, the CETA data will be introducing sort of mean achievement among subgroups, which would also sort of get at some of these questions. So we could see sort of, is it that, is the gap widening, but everybody sort of, the subgroups are both improving, but they're just not improving to the same degree, which is causing potential widening in the gaps. There's also some possibility that they'll be able to add gaps by socioeconomic status, but this is somewhat complicated by changes in how SES is measured by school districts and how it's reported by school districts, which is making that piece, I think, a little bit harder for the CETA team. I'm also interested in exploring maternal employment in this context, so using these expansions to look at whether this has facilitated moms working more, and as we've discussed, looking at private school enrollment. I've also looked a little bit at childcare subsidies, because one thing I'm sort of interested in is, as we were discussing earlier, sort of what you're shifting kids from when you expand the kindergarten day. And you could imagine that sort of if families were drawing down on childcare subsidies to cover those additional hours, that there's sort of some direct savings, right, on that dimension. The childcare subsidy data, I'd be interested, because I know some of you are working on these topics. The childcare subsidy data is a little blunt to try to narrow down sort of these movements that would be among 5 and 6-year-old kids, right? You sort of see school age and you see kind of young kids in that data, but it's pretty tricky to try to disentangle effects on sort of that school age group that is kind of just coming into school age. And also, you know, there's a lot of variation in what the child care subsidy landscape looks like in states. So, you know, it's hard to use the funding data to sort of determine whether that is like sort of a quantity or quality dimension. Sort of like, is it just more generous subsidies, or is it more kids served by the subsidies is somewhat hard to extract from the HHS data. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about carrying this forward, and I'd be interested in hearing sort of more comments and sort of continuing that conversation. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I think you guys said this earlier, but just thinking about policies moving forward, like how much room is there to go? What % of districts in the United States as a whole already have full day kindergarten?
Yeah, so as you've seen, it's sort of, you know, 75 to 80% of kids are in full day settings. You can, you know, I think some of the kind of, I'll call them lagging districts or places are places where families are sort of not interested in full day, and so there's no sort of policy pressure to move in that direction. So I think, you know, I think we may be in some ways as close to sort of full provision. But I guess to me the sort of more interesting question is sort of, are we kind of optimally deploying these resources? You know, if it's the case that sort of a more targeted program might sort of do more to kind of level the first grade entry playing field, or that sort of thing. You know, a lot of policymakers do ask about sort of the marginal early childhood dollar. Should it be directed to providing more slots in full day, or should it be directed to, you know, providing pre-K, 4-year-old pre-K? And so I think sort of more evidence on, you know, on these kinds of questions can help inform those kinds of trade-offs. Because I think I think the implication of your question is right. There's not a whole lot of movement to expand full. I mean, I think we're sort of at essentially near universal provision, probably as far as, you know, parents' preferences would take us. Yeah.
Do you have
Oh, sorry.
how policies like this are changing teachers who selected to teach in kindergarten and the types of activities and lessons that they're doing?
So, you know, I don't know a lot about that. I think it's a good question. You know, I think in some places, as I said, it hasn't actually sort of changed teachers' full-time equivalence status, right? So they're still there for the full day. They're now just teaching one group of kids for the full day rather than two different groups, which, I mean, we may think might be an easier situation. I don't know. Being around 5-year-olds all day is, I think, challenging. So, so I don't know a lot about sort of what it means for selection into teaching kindergarten. In terms of what they do, there has been some qualitative work and some nice work done on the full day kindergarten expansions in Indiana by other researchers in the state. And what they've largely documented, I also collected school schedules when I did my lottery study. And what they've found is consistent with what I saw, which is that in general, the extra hours were sort of a doubling of the instructional blocks that kids were experiencing in the morning. And I think this is sort of a post standardized test accountability kind of world where basically what you see is kind of a reading block in the morning and a math block in the morning, and then those are then repeated in the afternoon. So not sort of at least what I saw in school schedules was not kind of one version of the full day kindergarten pitch that you hear, which is that it would like allow more time for science activities and sort of other things. It seems like it's really just an expansion of the core curriculum. So it's sort of doing more of the exposure to early reading and early numeracy for these kids. Now, the other thing that qualitative work that I mentioned has documented is that it does allow teachers to use instructional grouping in different ways. So rather than sort of just like whole group stuff, which is all they kind of have time for in a half-day setting, they are able to do sort of more of those of you who know early childhood, more sort of like center-based work, small group work, and one-on-one instruction. So you can imagine that, that could have benefits in and of itself. Yeah.
So this has been focused on the transition from a targeted full K kind of policy to a broader, more universal.
Mm-hmm.
I lost track, and maybe you talked a little bit about this in your description of prior literature, but are there analysis of what was done when the targeted policies came into effect, and did they have similar or different effects on child outcomes and maybe on gaps? So did you see it?
Yeah.
There was a narrowing of gaps that happened under the targeted environment.
Right.
Sort of a little bit of backsliding now, but
I think that would be really interesting. The work that was done sort of in what I'll call kind of the old regime was really just using this ECLSK 98 cohort. So that was sort of prior to most of these expansions. But that's not work that sort of similarly is thinking about kind of the school district or like the systemic response to the intervention. That is, again, this sort of participant level changes within schools or within districts. And so, and the prior work doesn't really look at gaps. And so we don't really have that sort of comparison point to look at. And unfortunately, we couldn't sort of do a similar exercise because we don't have student achievement data for that time frame that would allow us to do that. Yeah.
So I think we sort of touched upon this a couple of times, but you haven't really told it. Are we fixing the budget here? Are we adding more resources? How should we think about it? So we keep talking about this as policy relevant, but are the policymakers pouring more money into this, and this is just this area and this class full day is just easily measurable? I mean, there's so many margins you can change quality here.
Right.
This is just one of them.
Yep. Yeah, so I mean, I think so. I would say we're certainly not fixing the budget. In a lot of cases, these expansions do come with more resources, but I think the way that looks varies a fair amount. But often, this is either when you have state level policy changes, this is states shifting sort of how they fund the per pupil expenditure for a kindergarten enrolled student. And so there's a little bit of that happening. There's also districts shifting, in particular, the pot of money that they most frequently are using, at least in my experience, is shifting their Title I dollars for serving disadvantaged kids to being able to expand full day. And so that's kind of one of the common sort of ways in which it's funded. And there's sort of this idea behind Title I dollars that you're supposed to...
What does that mean? It means they're taking away resources targeted towards disadvantaged kids and pouring them into...
Well, they're using them in this way, right? And they presumably they have to use them to support disadvantaged kids. And you're not supposed to, the way Title I dollars work is you're not supposed to sort of supplant what you were already going to do with the Title I dollars, but obviously what's happening is sort of if they're shifting those to support the disadvantaged kids in full day, then they're using whatever resources they were using for supporting kindergarten kids before for the non-eligible kids.
What happens if you redo your analysis, but instead of doing the full-time, part-time kindergarten, just use dollars expenditures or something like that?
Well, so I have per pupil expenditures in there as a control, and I can't really get to the fine point of like per pupil expenditures on kindergarten students, which would sort of be what you're asking, right? To sort of get at the shifts that are specific to these cohorts. Yeah.
But maybe something you can get at is whether the legislative change had a funding mechanism.
Yeah, so that is one of the things we're coding in the legislation. Very few of them do, but that is one of the things we're interested in, is sort of, does it formally change how it's financed?
Some hinges on Diana's question too. Do you have any idea about, in general, preschool teachers and early childhood education paid really poorly? So you're opening a public sector job with pension and benefits and so forth. Is there a shift, or how do you select on who goes into teaching these students from, the milieu of people who are making $20,000 a year with a BA working in the early childhood education outside of public school area?
Right. I mean,
Not seen anything on that.
There's been a huge shift.
I mean, you do hear anecdotally from Head Start programs and from that the shift of providing 4-year-old pre-K in public schools by a certified teacher has sort of stolen teachers out of Head Start and other sort of non-school-based settings. I mean, I would assume the same might be. I mean, a lot of the sort of credentialing structures are similar, and so you could imagine that as this opens up more kindergarten slots for teaching in the places where that happens, that could be pulling from other early childhood settings.
Very few ECE teachers are credentialed
Yep.
the way that you have to be for schools.
Yep.
I mean, Head Start's the exception, and only because it started to push 4-year
Yep.
degrees on people. So, I think I think actually my modestly informed suggests that it's actually a pull down of teachers from higher grades to kindergarten,
Yeah.
rather than a push up of early childhood.
Which
Because you get
means-
credentialed from K to 3, right?
Typically, yeah.
Yeah, it's K to 3 is the credential.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Other questions?
I wonder, in terms of the budgets and the resources, can you do placebo-type analysis of cohorts which will be affected by new policies?
Yeah, so I mean, the tricky part here is because I'm using the continuous expansions, they're sort of not unaffected years, right? I mean, one thing I've tried to do is sort of like characterize years as sort of big expansion years versus not. But it's tricky because there are sort of over time this like scaling up. And in some ways that felt a little to me like I was kind of picking and choosing what was a big expansion and what was not. And so you don't have years that are sort of unaffected entirely. And so that's, I think, kind of the tricky part in doing some sort of unaffected cohorts. Yeah. So even like my oldest grades, like essentially the first time they come online in the CETA data, I'm mapping them back to what I know about the full day kindergarten landscape in those places at that time. And so there's no sort of prior to the expansions, because they're happening sort of all over this time frame, which is why I was suggesting, I think there might be some ways to do, like to either code the legislation, to use the high change, low change, or to do some of these, whether the legislation had a funding mechanism or something like that, and characterize that as the treatment. And that would allow sort of for more of these like event study types of analyses and some placebo checks like on places that did not have that form of an expansion. All right, thank you all.